guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we have done it. We have finally made day number 1 of the 2023 World Championships Swiss stage. The main stage of Worlds has finally begun. In today's video, we are going to be seeing the first games at Worlds for the best teams in the world. Everybody at the tournament will be playing today. Everybody left, I should say, will be playing today. Of course, we've covered every single play-in game up until this point on this channel. We've previewed all of the round 1 matchups. You can go ahead and check out the video up in the iCard near the end of that video. We go over every single game that we're going to be going over today, at least in terms of previewing. Of course, if you're new to the channel, all year long, we have covered every single game from every single week of the top 4 major regions. That's LCS, that's LEC, that's LCK, that's LPL, and so I'd like to believe I have a pretty good take and a pretty good idea of where these teams are at. We've also watched all of the playoffs for all of the minor regions, and so the one minor region team in GAM that did end up making the main stage here, I do also have quite a bit of knowledge on as well, and so if you guys are excited for today's action, I don't want to waste too much time because we're going to be going over every single game in today's video just very quickly. If at any point throughout the video you find yourself enjoying it, saying, hey, I really like how this guy goes over analysis on this channel and, you know, how he covers these games, go ahead and hit the like button, hit subscribe. We're going to be posting about every single day of Worlds as we have done up until this point. It's not going to stop at the Swiss stage. It's going to go through quarterfinals, through semifinals, through the Worlds finals. We'll be covering the offseason and everything as well. And so if you find yourself enjoying the video, it really would mean a lot. But not to pander too much at the beginning, let's go ahead and jump right into the analysis. If you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate in their first game at Worlds. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we talk about. And of course, at the end of the video, we're going to quickly preview what's going to be happening on day 2. We're going to talk about all the matchups, who I think you can expect to win, and, you know, how these teams are just generally performing. Obviously, with the Swiss format being introduced this year, things are quite different. You don't have as clear a path out into the quarterfinals, into the top 8 as you might have in previous years, because you can get a little bit screwed by who you draw in some of these games. And we'll talk about some teams that have gotten lucky and some teams that have gotten unlucky, but it's time to kick it off. Round number 1 is a very, very important place to win. Getting in that 1-0 spot in Swiss is very important. Of course, it's not the end of your tournament. If you lose this first game, you're more than welcome to be able to win out from this point onwards, especially if you had a relatively tough opponent at the beginning of this, but you certainly want to put yourself in a much better spot having won the first game of Swiss, getting into that 1-0 bracket and, you know, getting some momentum under your belt. So which teams are going to be able to do that? Well, we're going to kick it off with a really fun matchup, one that I was really excited to see between Korea and North America. Always fun to see these two teams go head-to-head. And Worlds is in Korea. You have to kick it off with the most legendary Korean League of Legends organization. And it's a matchup between T1 and Team Liquid that T1 is going to be able to take. They're going to go 1-0 to start their Worlds tournament life with a really, really nice win here. But this was a crazy close game. This had no right being as fun and as close as it was. Team Liquid came out to play in this one. I had them ranked as the worst Western team coming into this tournament because I do think that, you know, momentum was kind of on their side, but they're incredibly unpredictable and they played a style that I expected to be able to be exploited a bit more by maybe some of the better teams in the world that are a little bit more clinical in the mid to late game, because that's where Team Liquid has struggled basically all year long. They have been really good at generating leads in the early game, and they've been really good at making flash plays in the late game, being able to secure objectives, but they've been really poor at actually closing out games, at doing anything to be able to keep the leads that they are able to generate through their skill. And while there were definitely moments in this game where it looked like, oh, those problems were starting to fix, they were looking like they're in a better spot, it just, you know, the problems come back around. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I tweeted that out after this game. We will get to that, but congratulations to T1. They're going to pick up the first win of the tournament here in the main stage for any team, and, you know, there's no better team to do it here at home in Korea for T1 to win their first game at Worlds in Korea since Season 3, which is unbelievable to make that statement, but You've got to be excited for these players. I know a lot of people were maybe a little bit more up or down on the LCK moving into this tournament, mostly down. I saw a lot of really negative takes surrounding the region as a whole, and I do think that it's a bit of a doomer mentality that isn't necessarily earned. I do think the LCK is a little bit better than people are giving it credit for, specifically the teams that have gone to Worlds. Teams like KT and DK, I think, aren't getting the respect that they deserve, but T1 definitely falls into that conversation as well. I got a lot of pushback for putting T1 at number 3 in my power rankings, and I just don't think that's necessarily the tape, right? Like, they were really consistent, especially in the playoffs. They really stepped back into form, and they were awesome. They found a style that they really were comfortable playing, and it didn't really match, you know, what was quote-unquote the meta at the time, but they were more than willing to play it, and they were just better than everybody else at being able to execute on that style. I still trust this team quite a bit, and while this game was very back and forth, I think a lot of that has to do with Team Liquid overperforming rather than T1 underperforming. There wasn't a lot of individual mistakes coming in from T1, although I don't think that they played exceptionally fantastic. They weren't making plays, they weren't being super aggro. They just didn't make any major errors, and they capitalized on the ones that TL did make and eventually got themselves into a part of the game where they could just close it out. They won one pivotal team fight down the end of the game, and that was it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Gumayushi in the bot lane. He's been really good over the course of this year, and I think a lot of people have started to catch up to that. I think Guma has been maybe the most consistent member of T1 with the exception of Faker over the course of this year, and even then, you could argue that Guma's been better because he's played more, but Guma was awesome here on the Ashe. It's an interesting draft ideology for both of these teams. I think both of them absolutely did their homework on the opposition, and that's really, really fun. I think that's what Worlds kind of should be. It's good to see T1 do that because oftentimes in the past, they've been a little bit disrespectful in terms of drafts against their opponent. They were not in this game. They took away the Ziggs. They took away the Nico, the things that APA has been a lot more consistent on, even things like the Callista that Jan obviously is very well known for domestically. They were happy to try and get them onto less comfortable picks, especially, you know, the mid lane and the bot lane, which we'll talk about. But I think T1 also made some mistakes in draft. I think that TL actually had a really good read on the direction that T1 wanted to go. I think B1 Orianna is just too bold. That champion is very consistent, but she is very slow, and there are plenty of opportunities to pick something that can be aggressive against a mid lane like Orianna early and try to generate too much pressure too quickly, and that's exactly what TL did. I love the Syndra on R1. That's a pick that we've seen do really well at this tournament, specifically into Orianna, and so I really like that pick. But then I guess you could say for T1 on the answer back, the Ashe Renata is a very interesting kind of calling of the bluff, if you will, for Team Liquid, because Core is definitely much better on these engagers, on champions like Rel, like Nautilus, you know, like that want to go in and set up and be playmakers for the rest of the team. So T1 saying, we're going to pick this lane that essentially loses to enchanters. If you want to pick a Karma, if you want to pick, you know, something like that, you're going to beat us. Like, you're going to pick a Janna, like, you're going to beat us, you're going to be stronger in lane, but then you're taking Core off of the things that he's most comfortable on. It's a really interesting draft phase, I think, from both teams, and I think both did a relatively interesting job, but honestly, I don't hate Team Liquid's draft here. I think Syndra is a really good matchup into Orianna, and specifically with the Lee Sin. You know, we haven't seen that champion do well at this tournament up until this point, but this was a really good Lee Sin game. We will definitely get into that. And then even the Aphelios Rel, I think it's honestly underrated as an early lane. Rel is very good early, and I know that Ashe, you know, Renata is going to kind of dominate the pressure, and we'll talk about the player diff that kind of happened in this game, but I really don't hate the idea of going Aphelios and Rel as an answer in this bot lane. I just think Guma and Keria were just better, especially early in the game. Guma was phenomenal. He's clearly so experienced playing these early game aggressive matchups. He knew how aggressive he could get away with without the enemy team really being able to answer. I think if Pioshik wanted to spend a little bit more time bot lane, perhaps this does go a little bit differently, but I understand the pathing from him. I understand wanting to spend a lot more time in the mid lane trying to get the top side of the map a little bit more secured down, but I really do think he could have played a little bit more towards bot lane, and this could have been interesting, but Guma and Keria ended up dominating early. Guma got really far ahead. He was so far ahead in gold against everybody else in the game, and I know a lot of people look at Ashe as a much more supportive option coming out of the AD carry role, but she can still be a hyper carry. She can still do a ridiculous amount of damage in the late game, and we saw Guma be really important. I thought he was the most important player in the game. I think Zeus was also really good. He's not going to get nearly the credit that he deserves, but Jace is just such a broken pick right now. We're finally seeing teams start to flex him back into the top lane. I don't know if top laners just aren't practicing him, but he still is a really good pick, and he has a lot of advantageous matchups. He's really good into Cassante, or at least he should be good into Cassante, and we saw that in this game. I know R5 Cassante ended up being good in certain scenarios. Some it's obviously obviously really good in the early game as a player, but you know, even as the game went on, like, Jace is still just an incredibly strong poke champion that's just going to be useful throughout everything that ends up happening. Oner and Faker definitely had their questionable plays. I think Faker was mostly fine, but he was a target of a lot of aggression from Team Liquid because Orianna has such low mobility and does take quite a bit of time to be able to get to the part of the game where she is as dominant. However, this game went 36 minutes. She did eventually get online, and obviously she was doing a lot of damage then. I'm still not sold on Oner. He was not the better jungler in this game. We'll talk about that. Pyosik was better than Oner, and Oner's certainly been a question mark throughout the playoff run and even before that for T1, but it was good enough for them to be able to pick up the win. I think they got this off the back of Guma and Zeus being really good, Faker and KIA making some good plays. Some of those ultimates from the Renata were obviously very important, but I really think top and bot were kind of the carries this game for T1. And then for Team Liquid, they tried their absolute best, and they did everything in their power to win this game. A couple of players in particular that I want to highlight. First of all, you know, a lot of what I said in the primer did end up coming to fruition for TL. Pyosik and APA have a special level of chemistry as a jungle mid duo. I know that's a weird thing to say because, you know, all the reports are that they don't speak the same language, you know, they're not super communicative, but they just get it. They know how to play off of each other. This was the big thing that started to propel Team Liquid specifically in the playoffs, was these two playing off of each other in an incredibly active and aggressive way, and boy howdy did that happen again. Pyosik had a DRX world champion level game. I cannot overstate how good Pyosik was. He was probably the best player in this game, and that's crazy to say, right? But the plays he was making on Lee, the kicks that he was able to get off, the solo kills that he was able to pick up, he was phenomenal. He almost single-handedly won this game for Team Liquid, and honestly, I debated giving him player of the game. I just didn't want to disrespect Gumayushi like that because I do think he played really well, but I think there's a really strong argument that Pyosik was the best player in this game, and if he's going to be able to do that for the rest of the tournament, Team Liquid is absolutely going to be a threat to anybody that they run into. But APA also was really good on the Syndra. He was a little bit too far forward in a couple of circumstances, but to follow up with a lot of the aggression that Lee Sin showed, especially in a winning matchup like Syndra and Ori early, to play as aggressive as he did and to be able to make a lot of the plays that he did, it's impressive for a rookie that's going on to their first international event and playing Faker in their first game. For him to play the way that he did with that much confidence, it's a big positive. And then Core JJ's the third player that I think also played really well. A lot of really good engages coming out from the Rel. Obviously a champion he's very well known for domestically. It's good to see him perform towards the higher end of his spectrum that we haven't necessarily seen domestically. It was Summit and Yon that didn't really step up for this team. Summit had a decent early game, and, you know, a lot of people are going to want to see Yon get the Dud of the Game award here, and I understand why, because he probably had less of a good impact on the game overall, but like I said earlier, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, and that's Summit. I mean, he was the single reason why this team really struggled a lot in the playoffs domestically. I know a lot of people didn't watch the LCS playoffs, and so you saw a lot of these tier lists that are ranking Summit as a top 8, top 9 top laner at the tournament, and the number 1 coming out of North America. Well, I watched every game in the LCS this year, and I can tell you from experience, Summit lost more games for Team Liquid than anybody else on this team over the course of this year. And this was a great example why. He's constantly caught out in side lanes. He's constantly going in and engaging on these backline flanks when his team is not prepared. It just doesn't feel like he knows how to play the late game at all. No matter how big his lead is, you can always expect Summit to throw it away in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, you can make the argument that Yon was worse over the course of the whole game, and I get that, but Summit made more, costly errors, I would say, in the back half that actively lost his team games. And the thing that's the most frustrating for me about that is that's exactly the problem that he had domestically, and it just doesn't feel like this team and that player, that Summit, has worked on it at all. It feels like it's the exact same problem with no change, no adjustment, no difference in mentality. And if that's going to be the case, this team is going to be this team's going to struggle to win. It's just as simple as that. Somebody's going to hold this team back if he continues to play like this. Yon also got completely outclassed, which is unfortunate because I thought he was relatively consistent in the playoffs domestically, but this is a different level, right? Guma and KIA are just a different level of bot lane, and he just couldn't quite step up. Certainly something to monitor, but he was not good enough in game number 1. But for both of these teams now, TL moves on to the 0-1, T1 moves on to the 1-0 side of the bracket. It's not the end of the world for TL to lose this. They looked good for most of this game, and Pyosik in particular looked like a superstar, but a lot of cleaning up to do in the late game for this team to actually be a real threat. And then for T1, I still think people are underestimating this team. I know this wasn't the cleanest win of all time, but I would expect them to be able to get better from this point onwards, and as long as Oner can be, fine enough in that jungle position, I think that there's enough talent on this team to compete with anybody. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 1, and this is one of the more intriguing matchups of the day, not only in terms of the teams being relatively evenly matched, but because NA versus EU is always a fun one to watch. It's a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCS in Cloud9 and the number 3 seed from the LEC in Mad Lions. And Cloud9 is going to be able to take the win in this game. They're going to go 1-0, and the reactions to this, I think, are both justified and unjustified from both sides. I think we've seen a lot of people kind of, jumping the shark, jumping the gun a bit on making, big decisions on both of these teams, and I'm just not sure that I saw anything in this game that makes me feel different at all about either of these teams from what I felt going into this tournament. I see a lot of people talking about how this is a major disappointment for Mad Lions, about how they super underperformed in this game, and obviously they didn't play well. I'm going to be entirely honest, this was not a good game from Mad. But did I see anything in this game that was all that different from what they showed domestically? No, this was basically the same Mad that showed up against Fnatic in the season finals, and specifically the one that was a little bit, they had moments where it was like, it's okay, but a couple of these players really underperformed, and we'll get to that. But for Cloud9, I also see a lot of people being like, wow, what a big win for Cloud9. Who saw this coming? They should have been the favorites in this game. I don't know why people are so surprised to see Cloud9 come out and just be more talented than Mad Lions. They have ridiculously good players on this team. They've just played way too greedily over the course of this year. I could see them getting punished by teams that are a little bit more clinical, but a team like Mad, who's basically the opposite of that, who is also just kind of foot on the gas, hope we can outpace you and just kind of set our own tempo to be able to win games. Cloud9 does really well in that archetype. That's why I picked them to win this game, and so I'm not particularly surprised at all by this outcome or by how the game ended up going. I think this was basically exactly what I anticipated in my video. So let's go ahead and go over what actually did end up happening for those who didn't end up watching the game. Player of the game for me is going to go to Blabber in the jungle, although I will say this was much more of a team effort than it was any one individual player on Cloud9 dominating. I think draft-wise, it's very interesting from both sides. I think both have advantages. Cloud9 is going to be a comp that scales really well into the late game. That's essentially why you're drafting this. Eminus has gone to the mid lane Cassante a ton over the course of this year, specifically back in spring. This was something he was playing a lot, but it really is kind of a pocket pick for him and something that I'm not surprised to see be brought out at this level. I still think Cassante mid is in a relatively decent spot, especially if teams aren't going to be able to capitalize on things that are gonna want to move around the map a bit more actively. I think that it definitely can work, but when you look at this, you see the Jax, you see the Talia, you see the Xayah. This is a very difficult team to fight into in the late game, specifically for Mad, who, yes, does have options, but they don't have a ridiculous amount of options, and so they need to win early. Luckily for them, they should have Prio in quite a few lanes. I think Syndra should do well early into Cassante. You're going to be able to kind of put pressure on him. He's not going to be able to do a whole ton in that laning phase, and in general, I think Syndra plus Jarvan is a very difficult mid-game comp to deal with. I think Mad Lions really spikes at around like 12 to 15 minutes into this game, specifically with the Ezreal and the Gwen, who I think are both really good in that stage of the game, and so if they could control some of the objectives, I could see a world in which Mad's draft is just straight up better. They picked a lot of the things that are really strong in the meta right now. Unfortunately, Cloud9 was a little bit stronger in that part of the game, using their mobility and their, advantageous play. They're pushing lanes a little bit better than Mad was able to, so they were able to pick up a lot of the pressure in that department. They were able to basically snowball the game out of control from that point, but Blabber, I think, did a really good job in this game number one of being able to do that. We've seen Talia's kind of fail to set pressure throughout this tournament up until this point in the play-in stage. It's been a pick that has not worked out in the way that it was working out in 2022 when she was incredibly strong, where it just felt like every single game she was shoving early. She always had Prio in her lane in the mid lane or in the jungle and was consistently everywhere that she needed to be on the map. If you were a really good Talia player, you could actively control the game. It didn't feel like Talia had that same kind of impact in a lot of the games that she was played in, not only throughout 2023, but specifically at this tournament. But Blabber made her look really strong here. I know the scoreline isn't as indicative of that, but he was everywhere on the map, constantly in all the plays that needed to be made. He was the one that was setting the tempo for the game. Mad Lions was essentially reacting to plays this game and not setting them themselves, and that was a lot because of Blabber and because of how active he was in the mid game. I'm high on Blabber. That's no surprise to people who follow the channel. People know that I think he's, one of the best, NA players ever. I actually think he's the best NA player ever, and, I think he continues to prove that internationally. He's been very good internationally every single time he's gone. It's just that the teams that he's been on have not been the most consistent over the course of his career, but he always seems to perform relatively well. Remember that Worlds in 2021, where he was a big part of why that team ended up getting out of group stage in what a lot of people considered a group of death. So Blabber continuing to look good. I think the rest of the team also looked really solid. Eminus was really consistent on the Cassante. I would argue this is his best champion. It's not the one that he's pulled out the most frequently, but it's the one that he's found the most amount of success on, and I would expect this team to continuously go to this. If I'm an Eastern team, I'm banning Cassante, because not only can Fudge play it, but Eminus just feels a lot more confident and a lot more comfortable at being able to play forward on a champion like this that doesn't necessarily get punished for his mistakes nearly as much. He's been punishable on things like the Jace and the Mages, the Orianas, the Syndras, etc. He has not been punishable nearly as much on picks like Cassante, so I don't know if he's going to be able to get this every game, but it's a really good thing that he got it in game number 1 for his sake. Berserker is so much better than Carzzy. Like, we'll talk about Hylissang making a ton of mistakes and giving a lot of gold over to Cloud9 in a bit, but what was really apparent is that my take on Berserker is going to age incredibly well. I said, separate Berserker from the region he played in. That was my big sentence that I made about Cloud9 in the primer, is you have to be able to separate Berserker from a North American AD carry, because he's not a North American AD carry. This is a guy who, you know, if rumors are to be believed, he's going to be playing in the LCK next year, or at the very least is getting offers from top LCK teams and getting tryouts from top LCK teams next year, and there's a reason for that. He's simply too good to be playing in this region, and it was very clear. He just outclassed Carzzy and Hylissang in this game, and Sven was solid on the Alistar as well. This has been kind of his engager of choice ever since he role swapped to support, and I think it looks good. Fudge also was aggressive in good ways. He definitely bodied Chasey in a matchup that I think is pretty Jax favored in my opinion, but still, you know, worth noting that he also made some plays throughout this game that weren't perfect. He's going to make some mistakes, but Fudge is a good player. I think Cloud9 is just more talented than Mad, and I think they showed that off in this game. And then for Mad, like, they didn't get to do the thing that they like to do. They didn't get to control the tempo, and every single time that they are able to control the tempo of the game, that they are given a lot of early pressure, that they are able to make plays and stay active and, you know, kind of really control which plays they want to make, they win games. Like, they're still a solid team in that regard, but when they don't do that, when they have to play from behind, when they give the enemy team tempo, they are completely lifeless. They don't know what to do in that circumstance. It's what I've been saying about Mad all year long, and so to see them lose in that way, again, it's not particularly surprising. I don't know why people are freaking out about this team saying, oh, this is such a surprise, or oh, Mad is some awful team. This is the same team that got to finals 2 splits in a row and won in spring. They just are playing better teams now. It just is the way that this playstyle ends up going. I think players like Hylissang in particular are really going to struggle in matchups like this, and he did. He's going to get my dud of the game. He was a nothing burger on a really strong champion in Rakan in this game, and he just did nothing. He really, really actively harmed his team in terms of the plays that they were able to create. I think Jarvan plus Syndra is a really strong mid-jungle duo, but Niski was nowhere to be found. He needs to be able to generate pressure early as the Syndra in this laning phase, because Cassante is just going to be able to outscale the Syndra, and that's what happened, especially when you get to the teamfight stage. Chasey got completely outplayed by Fudge. Like I said, Carzzy got completely outplayed by Berserker. It's just, Cloud9's better. Like, it really just is how it is. Cloud9, they play very similar styles. These two teams are relatively similar in terms of being strong from ahead and not so strong from behind, but Cloud9 has better talent. That's why I put them above them in my power rankings. This is not a surprise win to me, but it's nice for C9 to be able to get into that 1-0 bracket. That's 4 Barons through this tournament so far, and 4 that have gone to North America. Something that I don't expect to continue, obviously, but definitely a fun watch. This is a nice win for Cloud9. They're going to be in a much better spot, although they are going to have to play a much better team in the second round than Mad Lions. But for Mad, it's not the end of their tournament. I still think that they're going to be a team that looks good against bad teams, but when they go up against teams that have talent like C9 does, they're going to struggle. This basically went exactly as I expected, and I'm pretty happy to say that. Moving on now to game number 3 then, and game 3 was probably the biggest mismatch of the day up until this point. I know a lot of people expected that first game to be a pretty big mismatch, but this one was not close, and it never should have been. It's the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G, taking on the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports, and predictably, Gen.G absolutely throttled them. This was not a close game, and it really shouldn't have been. GAM is very, very happy to be in the Swiss stage, in the main stage of Worlds after making it out of play-ins. They did awesome as a team from the VCS to be able to kind of rebound after a rough start to the play-ins, losing 0-2 to Loud, and not dropping really anything after that. Really just looking fantastic the rest of the play-in stage. You know, having a little bit of an easier schedule, though, and, you know, definitely showing some ability to dominate teams that are just a little bit less talented than them. And so I was worried about them going into the main stage. They end up drawing Gen.G in round number 1, and that's just an auto loss. Gen.G is one of the best teams in the world. I know a lot of people are really down on the LCK, but there's really no reason to be. I mean, there is reason to be, which we will get into with some of the other teams, but there's really not a lot of reason to be down on Gen.G as a team, as an org. What they've been able to accomplish over this year, they've lost one of the greatest players of all time, in my opinion, the greatest AD carry to ever play League of Legends, in Ruler, who has only cemented that legacy this year on JD Gaming. They bring in a 17-year-old rookie who's never played at the top level, and he's the MVP for me in the summer split. It's just unbelievable how much of a rotation Gen.G has as an organization in terms of top talent. They bring in a new support from a team that had never really performed at a good level, a player that had shown flashes but never any sign of consistency at being able to be a top support domestically, and he's been fantastic for them all year long. And then of course you've got Doran, Peanut, and Chovy. Doran having the best year of his career, and Peanut and Chovy being fantastic. There's a lot of reasons to like this Gen.G team, and they showed them all off in this game. Again, I don't want to overreact to this team destroying GAM, because it should happen. It shouldn't be a close game, and it wasn't, but it is good to see them actually perform on it. Player of the game is obviously going to go to Delight in the support position. What an Alistar game from him. I mean, this is like a, are you sure you want to give him this champion the rest of this tournament kind of game. It really was that dominant. And in general, I just love Gen.G's draft this game. I think it gives them so many different options. I think the Alistar opens up a ton for them in the mid game, and that's really where they can start to explode, and that's where they did really start to explode. They basically have 3 winning lanes and a scaling advantage in this game, which is never really what you want to give over if you're the other side, but it's just a good draft on the side of blue side, right? Like, Kai'Sa into Xayah is generally going to be Xayah favored. However, Alistar has so much more prio in the early game than Set does, so all of a sudden that lane is actually pretty Gen.G favored, especially if Peanut wants to give some assistance, which he did. Ahri's definitely going to have the prio advantage into Nico. K'Sante is good into Jax, even if I do think that Jax is a good pick right now and does have a lot of advantages, one of the better picks into K'Sante. I still think K'Sante's the best top laner in the game, and I think he continues to show that. I just think it's a really good draft from Gen.G that gives them not only early options to be able to win if they are just better, which they definitely are, but also this just scales better. Like, you have way more options in the late game, as well as a team with Kai'Sa and K'Sante and Vi to be able to initiate team fights. Even the Ahri is going to be able to deal damage, so really like the Gen.G draft, and of course they played it well. Delight was spectacular this game on the Alistar. I've been a little bit lower on Delight over the course of this year, because I do think that sometimes his gameplay gets propped up a bit by how many opportunities he gets from playing with this team. I do think that Gen.G, in general, generates more pressure for their support than any other team in the world. It's kind of an easier job playing support for Gen.G, but that doesn't mean that Delight is a bad player. You can give the best player in the world an easier job, and it doesn't make him not the best player in the world, right? That's how it goes, but Delight's been really great all year long. He's another player that I feel like I've doubted way too much. I feel like I'm definitely starting to get on the train of Delight just being this crazy big playmaker. I'm still not sold on him being someone that you could put on any team in the LCK and him be a top 3 support, but to say that he's not a top 3 to 4 support in the world right now, I just can't make that argument all that convincingly. He's been great every single time he's been given the opportunity to do something big. Pays was obviously good, didn't have to do a whole ton this game. Delight set him up, and he capitalized, but it really was Peanut and Chovy that were the other form of aggression coming in from Gen.G. Chovy in particular moving around the map and being super active on the Ahri. Chovy has gained this reputation, whether justifiably or not, over the course of his career as being a lane-dominant, selfish player, somebody who doesn't like to play to propel the team specifically in the mid game. And while there are times where that has been true, specifically when his team is losing, he definitely feels the weight of feeling like he has to get as many resources as possible to win on his own. I've always believed that that is Chovy's biggest weakness. When he is ahead and when the rest of the team is performing well, there's no mid laner in the world that roams and plays for their team better than Chovy. It's certainly a reputation that, if you haven't watched the LCK in 2023 in particular, it's just dead. Like, that's not who he is anymore. Of course, there are going to be games where, Pays and Peanut and Doran all lose, and all of a sudden, Chovy's like, I have to be the one to win this game for my team. I have to sit in lane and get 400 CS so I can 1v9. That still is a mentality that he struggles with, but again, in 95% of games, Chovy's going to play like this, where he's moving around the map, playing with his jungle, playing to propel his support and his bot lane, and just being basically the perfect roaming mid laner, and that's kind of what he's developed in 2023. Peanut was awesome, Doran was really good, but this really was a Delight game. I mean, at the end of the day, he was the star. There's really no one else that you can point out. Like I said, I think I would be surprised if Alistar continues to get through purely because of how he performed on this game. Fantastic start to the tournament for him. And then for GAM on the other side, you know, it's fine. Like, I'm not going to sit here and shit on GAM. Like, that feels unjustified in terms of the circumstances that they had going into this game. It is worth noting that maybe you could have expected a little bit more, and they did try to do some stuff in the early game when this team is at its strongest with that Lee Sin plus Nico plus Set combo, where you can maybe catch some people out if they are positioning a little bit too aggressively. Gen.G didn't make those mistakes all that much, but the game wasn't, like, super out of control until the mid game, where in, like, 10 minutes, from, like, 12 minutes to 22 minutes, the game just ended. Like, a bunch of things happened in that time frame that just ended the game basically instantly. Before 10 minutes, it really wasn't all that bad for GAM, but, you know, that's just how it goes against the best teams in the world. They weren't expecting to actually hold their own. Done of the game is going to go to Pallet on the Set. I don't hate Set support in, you know, theory. I don't think it's particularly good right now, and I think specifically if you're going to play into something like B1 Alistair, I don't know if Set is the answer. I think you're sacrificing a little bit too much in the early game, specifically when you're building around a Lee Sin, to draft something like that, in my opinion. But, you know, Pallet is whatever. He's been better than I expected at this tournament. Same thing for Slater, but their big problems continue to show up. That, you know, if they play teams that are just more talented than them, they don't really have the gas to be able to compete with that. Slater and Pallet rely a ton on being able to kind of be really aggro in lane and be active and try to, you know, dominate team fights. It's what they did really well in the VCS, and they're just never going to have the opportunity to do that here. Players like Kati are good laners, but you're going into Chovy, like, that's your biggest weakness, or your biggest strength, completely neutralized, basically in Champion Select. And KIA, your best player, is going into Doran in a matchup that isn't particularly favorable, and he has to play super aggro in the mid game. And yeah, he died a lot. He died a lot isolated, but it's going to happen when you play Jax, especially with this team comp around him. And so, I don't know. I'm not particularly shocked. I'm not going to sit here and shit on GAM. They did their absolute best, but Gen.G is a legit good team, and I hope this game does prove that to a lot of people. And then moving on to our fourth game, our middle of the day, if you will, and this is another one that I think a lot of people kind of expected to be a bit of a blowout, but there was at least some pushback, more than maybe you would expect. It's the number 1 seed from the LPL in JD Gaming taking on the number 4 seed from the LEC in Team BDS. And Gen.G is going to be able to pick up the win. That's not going to surprise anybody. That's how we kind of all expected this matchup to go. However, BDS kind of did really well for themselves in this game. I really think if there wasn't such a massive mid and late game talent gap in terms of how these teams execute, then this could have been a BDS win. I like their draft. I like their execution. I like their confidence going into this game. I think that there was a lot of positive signs that honestly I just didn't get out of them in the play-in stage that I think are good. Now, that's not to say that there aren't parts of this game that are certainly concerning. There were a lot of things that they struggled with in the play-in stage, and there was a reason that I wasn't very high on BDS coming out of play-ins, and I do think some of those things definitely showed themselves in this game, but for Gen.G's first game at Worlds, maybe not exactly the dominant, you know, destruction game that you would expect, but still somehow very Gen.G flavored. Very much a game that kind of falls into their repertoire in terms of what they've shown over the course of this year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Start off with drafts. I actually think I like BDS's draft more, which is crazy to say. I think Gen.G certainly has options. Jarvan Ahri is definitely something that can play make in the mid game, and if you're going to play something like, you know, play against something like Garen, if you're going to leave it up, if you're going to, like, say it's okay that you want to play one of the champions that you're really good at, I think Ornn is a more than suitable answer that definitely plays into the style that Gen.G likes to go for. However, I do think BDS has a ton of options for how they want to play this game. I actually think all of their lanes are relatively strong. You get Adam on Garen, which is his best champion, in my opinion, or certainly has been over the course of this tournament. I mean, Darius is probably his best champion, and Gen.G opted to ban the Olaf instead of the Garen because I think they would rather face the Garen, which is fine, but Garen is certainly up there. I think for BDS, and them being able to get that on B4 is strong. I think Cassio is Nuke's best champion outside of the Azir, which they correctly, Gen.G that is, took away from Nuke. And then Crownie and Labrov getting Xayah and Rakan, which I think is the best early game lane-focused duo in the game right now. And so, you know, a lot of good coming away from BDS's draft, and I think some question marks from Gen.G on whether or not, you know, a regular average team would be able to play out a draft like this nearly as concretely. And I think we saw some of those concerns in the early game where I did kind of project BDS to be a little bit stronger. Kanavi really struggled to get off the ground, which is very interesting because I think he's the best early game jungler in particular in the world. I think that that's the thing that Kanavi excels at more than any other jungler. He's my number 1 jungler in the world, as he is for a lot of other people right now, but it's the early pathing and the ability to set the tempo up in the early game that has been basically unstoppable for him in the LPL over the course of the last, like, 3 or 4 years, essentially. But he did not have that kind of impact early on. He actually made some bad plays on this Jarvan that set Gen.G in kind of an interesting spot. And I want to give a lot of credit to Sheo, and I want to give a lot of credit to Adam in particular for being able to play really active and using the pressure that they wanted to generate on that side of the map to actually try and push their team forward. Adam had a big lead in this game. Yes, you kind of expected that when you drafted the Ornn. That's kind of the reason you drafted the Ornn, was that you could lose and still be super relevant, but it's worth noting that I think those two did play well. Nuke had a couple of good moments in the early game as well. The problem is that JDG is just way too clinical, and they just outplayed him in the late game, and that's gonna happen. Like, you know what I mean? JDG is gonna outplay you in the late game. Just kind of the thing that they do. Player of the game for me is going to go to Missing in the support position. The Alistar is really starting to run amok amongst Worlds. This is the strongest support champion in the game. I think you could argue that, you know, Alistar or Rakan is the strongest, but Alistar has just performed significantly better at this tournament up until this point. I think his engage is so consistent, and he does so much basically in every phase of the game. Early, he can be a big playmaker, and he can really change how people view the lane phase for any ADC matchup, and then in the late game, he's nigh unkillable, especially if his team is ahead, and so, you know, it can be a very difficult champion to end up playing into, and Missing made some incredibly important engages. This was a very good Alistar game. Not quite as dominant as what we just saw with Delight against GAM in the previous one, but still a very good performance. And then I think the two carry roles, those are the two players that you really have to shout out as being the big damage dealers this game. Knight and Ruler, both being fantastic. This is a prototypical performance from both. These are the best two players in the world, in my opinion. You know, Chovy's right up there, I think, with them. I think you could put him above or below either of these two, but Knight and Ruler, I think you could make the argument, are the two best players in the world at the current moment, and they performed like it in this game. I don't particularly love the matchup for either of them. Ahri and Nicasio isn't great for Ahri, and specifically Kai'Sa into Rakan is not particularly good for Kai'Sa early, but both of them bought their time. They didn't make any sort of mistakes in the early game. They didn't try to over-push the tempo during the time of the game where they were going to be most susceptible to some problems, and by the time they hit the mid to late game, they became the best players in the world again, and they were starting to take over fights even when they probably shouldn't in terms of the game state. So just really good stuff from them. Like I said, Kanavi definitely struggled this game, and there were some moments where it looked concerning. His late game team fighting was better, but he's going to need to shore up some of those early, you know, kind of problems. He's had some questionable early games at Worlds in particular in the past, and that's something I'm going to continue to monitor. It's been the thing that he's been the best at in his LPL career. I don't think it will be a problem, but certainly something to keep an eye on. And then 369 opted into a matchup where he knew he was going to lose, and he knew he was going to be relevant in the late game, and he did that. And then for BDS on the other side, I am impressed. I do like the idea behind it. Of course, going Garen Cassio is just super, you know, comfort for this team, and I think that that's a positive. I think Xayah Rakan's a good pick here. I think Vi, while I don't love Vi, I don't think she's a particularly impactful champion. I think she at least offers, you know, point and click, right? She at least offers something on a team that can be a little bit tricky to try and engage on. And for their credit, they played out some of these ideas well. Sheo spent a lot of time top lane to try to get Adam ahead, who has been this team's best player, not only all year, but especially at this tournament. He was really good in the play-in stage, maybe the best player in all of the play-ins, and he has continued to be really good for this team. He won early, hard. He had a massive gold advantage against 369, which is huge, but the problem is that this bot lane is still just a problem. They're still just not doing anything. Crownie is going to get my dud of the game here. I think if Xayah and Rakan had been a factor in this game, BDS is actually in a relatively interesting spot moving into the mid game, but you know, I'm going to try not to sound like I'm talking in hyperbole, because honestly, I think that's one of my biggest strengths as a content creator, is that I don't really, you know, blow things out of proportion. I try not to be reactionary in terms of my analysis, because I think that's kind of led me to a lot of success. That's the reason that my success rate is higher than most other analysts, is because I do think that I'm not super reactionary in terms of the way that I think, but I have to make some reactionary takes every once in a while, and Crownie's been like a bottom 3 AD carry at this tournament, including play-in teams. Like, he's just been really, really bad. There's really nothing else to say. He has had a few games where he's been okay, but outside of that, it's been Labrov trying to create action, and Crownie just, like, not doing anything. He played Xayah in this game against an Ahri, a Jarvan, an Alistar, an Ornn, so many champions that have the ability to get on him, and he just refused to ult. Like, I don't know what's going on. It feels like he has completely turned his brain off at this tournament, but we know he can be good. This is even worse than what he was performing like in summer, in my opinion, though, when I was talking about him as a potential bottom 3, bottom 4 ADC in the LEC in terms of the performance. It is not recovered. In fact, it's gotten worse, and that is very concerning. I think topside has been awesome for this team at this tournament. One of the more interesting topsides that I think any Western team has at this tournament. Adam has been sensational, genuinely one of the most fun players to watch of any team. Sheo's been really consistent, and I think Nuke has stepped up in quite a few games. Labrov has had a few good moments, but Crownie has just not been there, and it's going to be so important for him to get back on the same page as the rest of this team. If he can't do that, I don't expect this team to be particularly good in a meta where bot lane matters as much as it does right now. It's something to keep in mind. I'm not ruling it out from happening because he was so good in winter and spring. He was the best AD carry in Europe in winter and spring, but summer kind of showed some of the decline that Crownie had, and that is very much translated to the rest of this tournament. This was not a good game, but BDS at least survived the early game. They didn't completely crumble against what most people consider to be consensus the best team in the world right now, and that's good. They're going down to the lower half of the bracket. This could be a team that makes some sort of surprises. Play-ins do give teams a lot of chances to potentially learn the meta a bit better, to get some confidence under their belt, etc., etc. We've seen teams come out of the play-ins and do well in the main stage before. I'm not sure BDS is going to be that team, especially if bot lane is struggling, but they've shown signs of life, and Adam is awesome, so I definitely think they have the opportunity to make some things happen in lower bracket. And then for JD Gaming, 1-0, not a particularly surprising outcome. You would maybe have expected it to be a tad more dominant, but it was still a really good outcome for them. I think these players played really well, and I'm not concerned. This is still JD Gaming, and I think if you had a notion of them being unstoppable going into the tournament, this game should not change your mind on that. And then moving on to our 5th game, we are over the halfway mark here, and we now reach what is certainly one of the most intriguing on-paper games of the day. This is really going to determine, I think, a big portion of what happens for both of these teams moving forward. A very, very contested first-round matchup between the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports and the number 4 seed, I should say, from the LCK in Dplus KIA. And G2 does pick up the win. This is huge for them. We were talking about how important this match was for both of these teams when I previewed it at the end of the play-in stage. I talked about how G2 kind of going into this was, you know, really expected to be able to pick up a win, but DK is not this team that's just going to roll over and die, or at least I didn't expect them to be, and they certainly weren't in this game. A couple of misplays from G2 to allow DK to kind of get back into this, but at the end of the day, G2 doing the thing that they needed to do to put themselves in the best spot to win, getting a lot of comfort, and I think really playing towards that, and honestly, performing at a very high level. A lot of people told me I was too low on G2 by putting them in B tier. I still agree that B tier is probably the right place for them, but top 8 was probably the right place for them. DK is a good challenger, and they just weren't better than G2 in this game. My concerns were, look at the lineups. I mean, especially in terms of, like, talent level, I just wasn't sure that success was going to immediately come to G2 in the early game like it had domestically. A lot of people were pointing out about how good G2 was domestically, how dominant they were in a lot of these performances, and while I do think that would have been a major selling point if the LEC was still what it was 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't feel very confident that the LEC was this big bar. I actually see the LEC and like the middle tier teams, the 3 seeds, the 4 seeds, the 5 seeds in the LEC much more comparable to the LCS and the PCS and the VCS than I do the LCK and the LPL. Typically speaking, I just thought their body of work over the course of this year was really good against bad teams, if I'm being entirely honest. Maybe not bad, but not as good teams, if I'm being entirely honest. And, you know, I still kind of hold that opinion, but G2 came out and said, like, no, we were so much better than them for a reason. Like, they might not be an elite level team, but like we are an elite level team. We are the elite level team coming out of Europe, and that's really good to see. For DK on the other side, a very unfortunate game. Let's quickly talk about draft. I actually like DK's draft, and I think they put themselves in the position to win this game. I like their draft better, if I'm being entirely honest. Now, that's removing the idea that G2 is almost completely on comfort. You have Hans on the Draven, which is massive. You know, it's just something that you can't really allow G2 to have. It's the one pick that they've been the most comfortable and confident on to go, you know, for the most part over the course of this year. It didn't feel like DK did their research. They're banning out things like the Pyke, banning out the Kalista. I get it, like, Kalista's scary, but Hans on a Draven is scarier. I promise. I would much rather see him on Kalista than I would on the Draven. Even things like the Kog'Maw were major priority for this team down the stretch in the season finals, and it just didn't feel like DK was kind of respecting that. That being said, I think isolated on paper, DK's draft is better. You have more options in terms of both the early and the late game. I really like Azir into Orianna. I've talked about this a lot, but B1 Orianna is not something that I can particularly get behind with. I think Ori is a great champion to fill out certain types of comps, and she can be incredibly strong if you hit certain breakpoints, but she just doesn't have the agency, in my opinion, to be a B1 type of champion in the current meta. And I think playing something like Azir that, quite frankly, scales just as good as Orianna does into the late game, if not better, and I would argue better into the late game, while also just having way more prio in the early game, it's a problem. We've seen the Azir, we've seen the Syndra be pretty easy counters to this champion and have really made her struggle. It's going to be interesting to see if teams start to adapt to that. It didn't really matter in this game because the rest of the map won really hard card for the side of G2, but that was the first pick where I was like, that's pretty good. I think Alistar on R1 is solid. I think Rel in the jungle is really strong right now. Being able to get Rel on R4, second rotation is crazy. Or second, pick phase is crazy. And then Jace on R5 in the top lane is a great pick. I think Korea has very much adapted to Jace being as strong as he is, and they're willing to play him in the top lane if they don't feel like he's good in the mid lane at the current moment, or if they don't feel like they want to fit him in mid lane in the current meta. I like that. It's just, they didn't play good. There really is no other way to say it. They didn't play as good as G2 did. I think G2 utilized their skill sets a bit better, their champions a bit better. Specifically, this bot lane just outplayed the enemy bot lane. That's really, really where it came into effect. Hans and Mickey were awesome. Hans is going to get my player of the game, but this absolutely could go to Mickey X as well. This was an ADC gap. This was a support gap coming in from G2. I had a lot of confidence that Mickey X was going to be able to perform at a high level. Internationally, he's been the best player in Europe over the course of this year. He's been a complete game changer for G2 on basically any champion that they have put him on, whether that's been playmakers, whether that's been enchanters, whether that's been protectors. It doesn't really matter. He's been fantastic on every single one. He's been a game changer on every single one. I'm not all that surprised that Mickey X was better than Kellen in a game like this. We'll talk about Kellen. He made some very bad and big individual mistakes on his own. But Hans being as good as he was, I mean, first of all, he gets Draven, which is big because that's his signature champion. That's the one you really can't give him, but him just outplaying Deft in the early game was not something I saw coming. Deft is actually really good on the Varus, and I think Varus Alistar is a really strong lane, and specifically I do think that there is potential for this to win early if these two play well. They just didn't. They didn't play well at all, and I think if Deft and Kellen aren't going to step up, they've kind of been the rocks for DK over the course of this year. Showmaker, Canyon, Kana, they've been good at different points, but they've certainly not been consistent, and so when you're taking out the bot lane from DK, all of a sudden the rest of the team, has a much harder time of showing up. Kana and Showmaker, I do think, had good moments, and Canyon was certainly good in this game, or good enough where I think they could have won this game. He made a couple of really big engages towards the back half. Kellen was miserable. He's gonna get my dud of the game super easily. Messed up the Alistar combo multiple times. I don't know if it's nerves. I don't know if it's just mental. I don't know what it is. Kellen was really good in their playoff run and in their regional qualifier run in the LCK. He was someone that was propelling this team. When they put him back in over Bible, this team got infinitely better. To see him perform so poorly in game number 1 is frustrating. This is not the Kellen that I think we've grown to know. I don't think this is a super repeatable performance for him, but it's certainly worth noting that this is concerning. Now, again, it's not to say G2 didn't earn this win. Hans and Mickey were sensational. Broken Blade had a really good game on the Renekton, had a lot of really clutch team fights down the stretch. Yike played so well. Yike played his first ever Worlds game into Canyon, arguably the greatest jungler of all time, and he outplayed him, and that's super huge. Caps was pretty consistent on the Ori, didn't really need to do a whole ton in the early to mid game, just needed to allow his bot lane to scale out of control, and he was going to get to the part of the game where he could be strong, and, especially if his team was already winning, he could be relevant. This was a good G2 win. Now, it wasn't the most dominant. They gave over that Baron basically for no reason because, I don't know, they just wanted to flip it, and they did. They flipped it, and they lost it, and it happens, but that's not something that they're going to be able to get away with against the top 5 to 6 teams in the world. They're going to need to clean that up if they want to start entering that conversation, in my mind. They're still somewhere around top 7 for me, which is where I had DK. I had them at number 7. I think they're probably right there at number 7 or at number 8, depending on how you feel about another team we'll talk about later that was above them, but they are certainly in that top 8 right now. I think they proved that. And for DK, there's a lot they need to work on. I think the bot lane definitely needs to shore themselves up. I have faith that the top side's going to be fine because Canyon and Showmaker just show up at Worlds, but this is not the way you wanted to start off the tournament. Going 0-1 at the start is certainly a predicament that you've now put yourself in. You basically need to be perfect from this point on, but at least the schedule gets easier. But again, for G2, this is a massive win and one that Europe desperately needed after their start here. And then moving on to our 6th game of the day, and this one is kind of intriguing to talk about. Not really a blowout, but also not close in any sort of respect. Not an upset, but I guess it is in terms of seeding. It is the number 1 seed from the LCS in NRG, taking on the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming, and Weibo does kind of destroy them in this game, and that is to be relatively expected. I don't think a lot of people went into this expecting NRG to dominate or to really be able to keep up, if we're being entirely honest. It's just a little bit of a talent gap. I like NRG, and honestly, they overperformed a ton in the LCS playoffs. This was a team that peaked as the year went on, and they certainly peaked in the playoffs when they were able to take home the trophy, when nobody predicted them to do so, but this just feels a little bit out of their depth. Weibo is one of those teams that at any given moment can play like a top 1 or 2 team in the world. You know, that being, you know, relevant in a lot of different circumstances in the LPL over the course of this year. And that definitely came back in this game. There's going to be a lot of people talking about draft. There's going to be a lot of people talking about some funny comments made by Xiaohu before the game started. But at the end of the day, I think the takeaway from this is both of these teams are probably what we wanted to see expectation-wise. LNG, maybe we could have seen a little bit better, especially with how some of the other North American teams have performed on day number 1, but, you know, it's not particularly surprising to see them get absolutely destroyed here, which is kind of what happened. Let's go ahead and talk about it. First of all, with draft, I see a lot of people commenting on it. I see this kind of being the prevailing topic that people are talking about, that people are saying, you just drafted Jace, Kalista, Alistar into Poppy. What you doing? And I do understand that. I do get the idea that, like, there's a lot of anti-synergy there, that Poppy in general is very strong this game, but let's not pretend like Poppy doesn't counter 90% of the meta champions right now. I know that it's very fun to dunk on LNG for picking champions that are, you know, good, or particularly, like, bad into Poppy, I should say, that Poppy is good into, but it's not like they could have picked a bunch of alternatives that aren't meta that would have been just as good. A lot of the meta champions just aren't good into Poppy. Poppy's really strong, and nobody has been picking up on that. She got a ridiculous amount of bans in the plans and has kind of fallen off the radar as we've gotten into the main stage. I don't expect that to last. Poppy's really good. Weibo's played a ton of Poppy over the course of this year. In fact, this is a very Weibo draft, and I do think that that is really solid for them. There's a lot to take away from this. I think in particular, if you're going to go into something like Jace, Azir is probably the idea behind what you want to do to go into that. You can survive pretty efficiently in the early game. Azir doesn't really need to be in a good position early to be able to scale late. And Azir is one of the few champions that in the mid to late game is just simply going to have a bigger impact than what Jace has from an advantageous position. And so I do like the Azir pick. Obviously, Xiaohu's really good at it. He was able to pick up a solo kill pretty early on in this game onto the Jace as well, which just completely destroys Jace's matchup. But I would argue that Azir is like the winning lane for Weibo in this game, certainly in terms of the isolated 1v1. But my counter argument to this being an awful draft for LNG that just gets destroyed by Poppy is that Ornn's really good into Rumble, and I know you're taking big dokes and you're putting him on a tank, and that's not what you want to do, but Ornn's really good into Rumble, and Kalista Alistar should absolutely massacre Kai'Sa Leona. Like, there is no world in which that lane shouldn't be Kalista Alistar favored. They should just be the better bot lane there. The problem was gameplay more than anything else. I know people love to shit on draft, and that loves to be kind of a consensus, but I don't think LNG lost this in draft. I think LNG lost this in game, and that's how most games are. Let's be entirely honest. Most games are lost in game. 99% of games, 95 probably, are lost in game and not in draft, because I think they just lost early, and they couldn't really afford to lose early. They needed to be able to kind of, I guess, set the tempo and be able to snowball themselves out of control, because the scaling on Weibo is just infinitely better. Azir Kai'Sa is unstoppable in the late game, specifically if with a Poppy and a Rumble. Like, you're never going to win a team fight against Weibo if you're not able to dominate early, but Kalista should be able to win early. Ornn is going to give a lot of necessary development early, and even Jace is someone who can spread a lot of pressure, especially with the Talia. It just didn't work out. They weren't as good, and that's okay. Weiwei is going to get my player of the game, because that Poppy, like, it was really, really good this game. I was really debating between Weiwei and Xiaohu. I think those two were definitely the standouts, which is really good to see from Weibo, because talking about them pre-tournament, talking about them at that number 8 spot, people were mad that I put them above G2. And my reasoning at the time was that the bot lane was, in my opinion, just slightly better than G2's. I trust Light more than I trust Hansama, and I think Crisp is one of the best supports in the world. I've been really high on him for quite a long time, and, you know, I thought that they were just going to be slightly more consistent. Now, G2 looked fantastic, but Weibo also looks fantastic, and, you know, like I said in that primer, Weibo's success at this tournament is almost entirely going to be dedicated to their play and not the play of anybody else. When they are on their game, when they are playing at their best, they're a top 1, top 2 team in the world. They're 2-0 against JD Gaming in the regular season this year in terms of series. That's absurd. Like, they beat JDG twice in a best of 3 across multiple different metas. Like, that is incredibly impressive, but that's the ceiling that this team has when they're playing well, and a lot of that does hinge on Weiwei and Xiaohu in particular. Xiaohu's been good. I think he's honestly been underrated throughout this year, as he has been throughout his entire career. LPL fans just generally like to find reasons to say that Xiaohu is on the downswing or on the tail end when he never really is. Like, I understand that his laning isn't as dominant as it was maybe 4 years ago, but his team fighting is still some of the best in the entire world, and when you put him on things like Azir, he's going to be useful. And as we saw in this game, his laning is still really good. He was able to pick up a solo kill on Palafox, and Weiwei was really the standout for me. He's kind of been both a good and a bad factor for this team. He's not quite been what Karsa was, which was this extremes player. Karsa was somebody who would have much better games than what Weiwei has had over the course of this year, but he would also have much worse games than what Weiwei is having. Weiwei's just somewhere in the middle. Not to say he's not volatile. He will have bad games every once in a while, but the good ones really hadn't been there as of recent. There was a lot of the rest of this team kind of carrying it, specifically the bot lane, but this is a good showing. If Weiwei can step up and be a pretty elite, or at least an upper level jungler at this tournament, a top half jungler at this tournament, that's going to be massive. That's really going to change what Weibo is capable of doing. And you're just going to hope that they're going to be able to carry this over. As for NRG, they overperformed in the LCS playoffs. What can I say? This is not really the #1 seed from the LCS, and we shouldn't really give them the expectations of the #1 seed from the LCS. They really are a team that has kind of found their form recently and is going to struggle a bit, maybe playing some of the more talented teams in the world. As much as I do think players like Palafox are incredibly talented, and I think Dplus could go one-on-one with someone like the Shy if he were given a little bit of a different matchup, I just don't think the rest of this team is going to be as consistent. FBI and Ignar were massive in that playoff run, but they're not a bot lane that I'm expecting to be able to go up against Light and Crisp and survive, and that was the case here. They were kind of given the opportunity to play this more early game focused bot lane, and they just weren't going to be able to capitalize on the advantageous part of the game that they needed to capitalize on. They're not going to be able to win early against Light and Crisp, who are just more talented. FBI's dead of the game, but you could give it to Ignar. You could give it to Contracts. I think they're the players. Even Palafox got solo killed in this game, even though he was doing a ton of damage on the Jace. Dplus was fine on the Ornn. He was probably the one player that I felt pretty good about. He's in a good matchup against, the Rumble into the Shy, but, there's only so much Ornn can do to try and salvage a game that has already gone too far out of control. It just was kind of the expected way for NRG to lose. They just kind of got outskilled. I'm not surprised. I think they're going to continue to struggle at this tournament, and this is not a team that I have ridiculously high expectations for. I do think they will do better against teams that are a little bit closer to them in terms of skill level, because I do think they have a good idea of how they want to play out their early games, and they know how to play around the win conditions that they draft for. But Weibo's just too talented. Weibo is a genuinely good team, one that should be getting out of the main stage, of the Swiss stage here at this tournament, and they proved that again, and I think a lot of people maybe are going to be surprised with how good this team is, but again, if you listen to K-Drill, probably not. And then moving on to game number 7, we're reaching the end point here. This one was kind of interesting on paper in terms of the matchup. I didn't think it was going to be particularly close, and it turned out to not be, but at the very least, I think it's cool to see both of these teams kind of show some of the both good and bad that they showed domestically. We have the #2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic taking on the #3 seed from the LPL in LNG Esports, and pretty predictably, LNG is just kind of the better team in this matchup. I know that that's a pretty easy thing to say, that yes, LPL is better than the LEC, but specifically everyone outside of G2 I think struggled a lot over the course of this year. Fnatic got better as the year went on, but they still had some major question marks going into even the finals of the season finals in the LEC. This was the #2 team in the LEC, and they didn't necessarily feel like that really at any point throughout the year. They did end up getting there, but only really by de facto, because everybody else kind of shit the bed at the wrong time, which we've talked about previously on this channel. LNG, on the other hand, have been peaking at the exact right time. It feels like this team has gotten better and better and better every single game that they have played together. This trio that they have put together through the mid-year of Tarzan, Scout, and Gala is one of the best in the entire world. One of the few that I think, from a pure talent perspective, can actually go toe-to-toe with JD Gaming. And we saw that. We saw them be able to take down BLG in the playoffs. We saw them make the finals, and we saw them crush their way in the regional qualifier to Worlds here. And I think that a lot of people, me included, think that they're one of the top, 3 to 4 teams in the world at the current moment. I think that they are just below, teams like JD Gaming and Gen.G and whoever you want to put in that top tier. I think LNG is right there. I think they are the second best team coming out of the LPL, and so I had pretty high expectations coming in for LNG at this tournament. And game number 1, you can check off the success bar. That was pretty darn good coming in from LNG. Basically everything that they showed in the regular season and in the playoffs ended up translating into this first game. Yes, it's Fnatic who... we'll get the draft out of the way quickly and first, because I think this is a trap that a lot of Western teams fall into when they come to these international tournaments, is they feel like if they draft for early game, if they feel like they can draft to win, lane in a bunch of different places, that they should be in a position to be able to outplay and outskill their much more talented opponents, because they're giving themselves advantages early on in the game. But the problem is that the Eastern teams are so good at being able to shut down and neutralize aggression that if you give them this massive, massive scaling advantage, like you gave LNG in this game, it's just doomed. And even then, yes, this is a massive early game I guess, buff for Fnatic. Like, you have an early game oriented comp with Taliyah Jace, with Renekton, with the Ezreal. You're not exactly winning every lane. Like, I would argue that Jace doesn't do particularly well into Azir, for reasons that we've already mentioned in this video. I would argue that Ezreal doesn't do particularly well into Xayah, specifically into Xayah Rakan, who is just a really strong, it's the best lane in the game right now in the bot lane. Like, Jarvan is so active in the early game. You're not even really winning in the early game. So what exactly does this draft do? If you're Fnatic, I'm really not entirely sure. I don't think that there is a ton of upside towards what they ended up picking. They drafted a very niche window for them to be able to take advantage of, specifically if Razork and Oscarinin probably generate a massive lead up on the top side. But when that didn't happen, when Zika ended up getting stronger just purely by playing Jax, and then the rest of the map ended up crumbling, and, you know, everybody, all the main carries on LNG started getting fed, there was just no way for Fnatic to get back into the game. Player of the game is going to go to Scout for me. This is just exactly what I wanted to see. I don't think anybody was talking about Scout potentially underperforming at Worlds, but I do think it was a question on whether or not he truly was a top, you know, 2 or 3 even player in the world at this point, because he kind of has been over the course of 2023. Talked about that in the primer. In terms of performance over the course of this year, I don't know if there's an argument that anybody has been more individually impressive than Scout over the course of 2023, and that is carried over into game number 1 here at Worlds, where he's going nuclear. Like, this is the best he's ever played in his entire career, and this is arguably a top 10 LPL player ever. Like, that's where he's at in terms of how Scout is performing at the current moment, and this game was phenomenal. He gets one of his signature champions, the Azir, something he's played a ridiculous amount, not only this year, but over the course of his career, and he dominates on it. Humanoid looked like a disaster this game, which we will get to, but a lot of that is Scout just abusing basically everybody that he has gone into. The Humanoid Worlds buff has certainly not activated yet, and Scout made him look silly. He made Razork look silly in the early game, and he made everybody look silly in the team fight stage of this game as we went further and further. Scout has just been phenomenal. Everything you could ask for from a superstar mid laner. Gala and Hong were also really good in the bot lane. Like I talked about, Xayah Rakan just gives you so much prio, so much pressure early in a game that even when you're going into something like Ezreal Rel, which first of all is just a bad lane, I don't think I would ever be drafting that at Worlds. That just seems like something that you really shouldn't bring out. Even when you are going for this more early game kind of dominate lane style of comp, Ezreal's going to be super safe, but he's really not going to give you what you need against Xayah. In particular, yes, he can dodge the Rakan engages, but it's not like he synergizes particularly well with Rel. Perhaps you can get Rel on the move and you can leave Ezreal isolated in the bot lane, but Gala's too good for that. He's going to be able to generate leads on his own, and it's not like Hong can't follow those engages coming out, and so I don't know. Don't love this draft, but in general, like, you give Gala and Hong the best lane in the game, and they're going to dominate on it. They're just better than Noah and Trimby on the other side of this map. And again, that was very clear. Razork was really bad for most of this game. Started to turn it on as it went further and further along. He was much better in the team fight stage, which is interesting because that's not exactly the tape that we've seen from Razork over the course of this year. He's somebody who, you know, even more so than maybe some of the other junglers at this tournament. This is a trend, I think, for most junglers, but he's really good from ahead and really bad from behind. If you give him tempo and if you give him pressure, he's going to be able to do a lot with it. He's just not very good when he has to try and play somebody else's game, which is pretty normal for the jungle position at this time. But I think Razork definitely suffers from that a bit more than maybe some of the other top tier junglers at this tournament. But, you know, he was kind of much better at, you know, when the team started to fall behind, he started dealing a lot of damage. His team fighting was really good. It was just too late. He made too many major errors early in the game that gave LNG a lot of pressure and a lot of gold, and they weren't able to recover. Oscarinin wasn't very good on the Renekton. Fnatic just wasn't able to rebound. And like I said, Scout was phenomenal. Gala and Hong were great. Tarzan was really solid on the Jarvan, a pick that we've seen kind of dominate over the course of Worlds so far. And Zika on the Jax was always just going to be able to outscale and hit that part of the late game where he was going to be incredibly strong. And so LNG looked great. This is basically exactly what you wanted to see from them. Scout in particular stepping up and being that dominant carry that he has been all year long for this team. And Fnatic, you know, they drafted a lot of comfort. They've been going to Taliyah a lot. They've been going to Ezreal a lot. These are picks that they've been, you know, really trying to make work. I just don't think that this was the game to try something like that out. I think they're going to have to adjust if they want to have any kind of success at this tournament, and I think LNG has clearly shown that they are one of the top teams. This is not a performance that I think this team is going to take lightly. I think they're going to really kind of hone in and lock in after this win, and, you know, it's going to be interesting to see who they draw in the next round, but I have a lot of confidence and a lot of faith in this team after this performance. And that's going to bring us to our final game of day number 1 here. I do appreciate you guys sticking with me, getting to the end of this video. I know it's coming out a little bit late. I do apologize for that. As you guys know, I do work a full-time job outside of this, so making sure I catch up on all the games as well as get these videos out for you is definitely a priority, but You know, sometimes they're going to come out as games are going on day number 2 like they are here. But getting into our final game here, it is a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 3 seed from the LCK in KT Rolster. This was the matchup I personally was most looking forward to on day number 1. This and G2 DK were definitely the two matchups that I think were the most interesting in terms of the outcomes and how they might shape out the rest of this tournament, because I think this is the only matchup between teams that you could really confidently say are definitely in the top 6. I think that both of these teams are pretty definitely in the top 6, at least for me going into the tournament. I don't know if that's going to, you know, work out the entirety of this tournament, but they both looked really good domestically. I think KT is getting completely shafted in terms of, you know, public perception, mostly because I think that there are some very popular streamers that don't see them very favorably. Not calling K-Drill out, but he is certainly one of them. I just think that a lot of, you know, analysts have talked about KT as being this weak team, forgetting that they were the best team in the regular season in the LCK. They dominated everybody. They beat Gen.G, they beat T1, they beat Damwon, they beat everyone. They beat Hanwha Life, they beat anyone that they needed to, and they beat them convincingly. People going into the playoffs saw them as title favorites, as that number 1 seed. Obviously, I was lower on them at the time. I did not predict them to win the title. Hell, I predicted them exactly where they ended up, which is the number 3 seed, losing to T1 twice. Feel pretty good about that prediction, but that being said, I feel good about this team at Worlds. I think they're crazy undervalued, but Bilibili's also great. I think these two teams are kind of in weird situations where both of them ended the year a little bit weaker than they showed in the regular season, two respective number 1 seeds going into the playoffs that couldn't quite make finals, which is definitely disappointing, but in this one, Bilibili comes out on top. They're just kind of the more talented team. They've been able to show more over the course of this year, and this certainly doesn't take away from KT Rolster. I think that they put up a pretty decent fight in this game, but Bilibili is just crazy, and their 2 star players, and I guess I should say their 3 star players, all showed up in this game. Jun and Yagao, not necessarily as dominant as maybe you would like, but they still played really well. But at the end of the day, this is about Bin, this is about Elk, and this is about On, who I think all played fantastic. And these are the 3 players that I told you guys to look out for. They're the 3 BLG players that were in my top 20, and I think they deserve to be there. They beat their counterparts who were also players that were in my top 20, Keen and Lahens, both making that list. BDD obviously making it as well, but let's talk about drafts really quick. BLG's is just straight up better. I think you have a little bit more aggression in the early game. You basically have 3 winning lanes, although I think you could argue that with the Maokai being a little bit slower, you're not exactly going to be able to fully take advantage of that. It's not like these are 3 dominating lanes, but I like K'Sante into Aatrox. I think that's a pretty good matchup for K'Sante, even though Keen clearly likes it going R5 Aatrox. Jace obviously is just going to have more prio, specifically in the 2v2 if you want to take the jungle battle against the Taliyah. And then I really like Xayah Rel. I've been talking highly about Xayah this whole video. It's just going to be stronger early, even going into the Rakan if it's with the Kai'Sa. I think Bilibili has a lot of options in the early game. Where you're looking at KT to potentially try to break through is the mid game in this one, where I do think they have a very strong mid game comp. There's a potential for them to be able to kind of rebound and, you know, make some interesting plays happen, and they did. That was the part of the game where they felt relatively good. Even going into the late game, it felt like their team fighting was relatively solid. They weren't giving over a ridiculous amount of resources, but they also weren't keeping up in terms of pressure without losing something else on the other side of the map, which is definitely unfortunate. It's always difficult to have to try and do this against a team like Bilibili that's very clinical, but I think KT put in a nice effort. Player of the game, though, has to go to Bin in the top lane. I say has to go. It doesn't really have to go to Bin, because Elk was just as good. It does have to go to one of those two, because I think both of them played as like top 1 in their roles in this game. Bin proving why I, you know, having him as the number 1 top laner in the world was absolutely the right decision at the current moment. He went against who I had at number 2 in terms of my top laners, and quite frankly decimated him. K'Sante's a ridiculously disgusting champion, but you still have to be pretty good to play him at a high level. We've seen some pretty average K'Sante's, even over the course of this day and over this meta. We've seen some K'Sante's that just haven't been able to take over in the same way. That's not Bin. Bin is able to completely destroy the game on this champ. It reminds me of just what he's able to do when he's on champions like Gwen, or when he's on champions like Rumble, or when he's on champions like Jax. He just does this on everyone, right? He's just that good. It's Bin. You know what he does. He's fantastic, and he's ramping up at Worlds like he basically always does. I feel really good about the top side, but Elk was sensational. I don't think I've seen an AD carry react in such a phenomenal way in a long time. I mean, this was like 0.01 second reaction time. Someone check his brain for being able to react as quickly as he did to a lot of these engages. They were well-timed engages coming out from KT, whether they were coming from the Rakan or from the Zac. Very, very interesting ideas here, but Elk is just too good. Like, that really was the problem. I think that if Elk was an average AD carry, or like even not a top, 3 or 4 AD carry in the world, I think KT has a real chance to win this game with the amount of times that they got really close to getting on that Xayah and shutting her down, but it was nearly impossible to do that into Elk, who just played fantastic. On was really good on the Rel. I think that champion's in a really good spot. Yagao was solid on the Jace. I thought Jun was pretty good on the Maokai. BLG did their job. I would have liked to see them be a little bit more clinical in the back half of the game, maybe closing it out a little bit quicker. I think they gave KT a little bit too much in this game. Credit to KT for taking that, but I think that there were circumstances where BLG probably could have had their foot on the gas a little bit more, and they didn't do that, but I think for the most part, they were fine, and they were really strong in this game. And then for KT, I'm certainly not going to overreact to this loss. They still played relatively well. A couple of major mistakes. I do think that the solo laners definitely disappointed in this game. I debated on whether to give dud of the game to Keen or to BDD, who I think both really just didn't show up in the first game here. I'm going to give it to Keen. There were a couple of team fights where the Aatrox definitely was viable and was kind of looking like, okay, well, I see why you picked this, but in general, Aatrox is just not on the same power level as something like K'Sante on the other side of the map. Even if you particularly like the matchup, if Keen does, I don't, but if you like the matchup, then that's fine. I just don't think it was... you're never going to be more relevant than K'Sante at any point in this game. You're a more scaling version of Renekton at the current moment, and I just don't think that that necessarily works with the rest of this team comp that does want to spike in the mid game. And speaking of that, you've got the Zac to Leah mid-jungle duo. I think this is very active, and obviously you can make a lot happen here. And they did. I'm not going to try and sit here and say that Cousin BDD weren't trying, but I would have liked to see BDD play a little bit better. His positioning in this game was quite poor, and that's definitely something to point out. He was quite poor at the end of the playoffs as well. Was pretty decent in a couple of games against T1, but I don't know. It just didn't feel like the same BDD that was in the regular season when he was in the playoffs, and so something to keep an eye on. I thought Lahens was fantastic in this game, though. I think that he showed a lot of good things. Aiming was really good and did get quite a bit of gold onto the Kai'Sa and really created an avenue for KT to potentially get back in this game. The bot lane in general was solid, and I think the Zac is a pretty interesting pick. Talked about it a bit in the meta video. I could see some teams going towards it. I think there are just better options. Like, it's very interesting to me to see Zac over Sejuani or, R4 and not just early picking Maokai. Like, it's certainly an intriguing option to go for something like Zac. But I don't think it's entirely unviable at the current moment. There are definitely situations in which the engage and the consistency that Zac provides could be a positive. I just don't know if I would go towards it super consistently over the course of the tournament. But in general, I think KT did a lot of good things this game. BLG was just simply better. So them moving to 1-0 isn't particularly surprising. I just feel really bad for whoever ends up drawing KT in the 0-1. Alright, but that is going to do it for day one coverage here in the Swiss stage of Worlds 2023. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the day two kind of schedule and just everything here for the Swiss stage. It's going to be the main graphic that we put up at the end of these videos. We're quickly going to go ahead and preview some of the 8 games that are going to happen on day number 2, but the first one is happening right now. TL and LNG are playing as I'm recording this, and so I want to make sure I try to get this out as quickly as possible so I don't miss too much of these games. But let's go ahead and go over some of these previews, starting with the 1-0 side of the bracket. First of all, unfortunate draw, but I guess it could be worse. I guess we're getting all of the regional matchups out of the way early on in Swiss stage here. Obviously, nobody wants to see all of the regions play off against each other, especially when 5 of the 8 games in round number 2 are just, the same region playing off against each other, but it should mean that we get significantly less of those matchups as we go further and as the games start to matter a bit more. And so we'll go ahead and preview them now, starting in order from what my graphic says, with Weibo Gaming versus G2, which in my opinion is clearly the most interesting matchup that we have gotten in round number 2. Maybe it's not the matchup of the highest quality. There are a couple of really great teams playing against each other in round number 2 here, but Weibo G2, in my opinion, is the most interesting because I think this is really going to show us who truly is, elite at that level. Who is a team that can compete with potentially the top 4, top 5 teams in the world at the current moment. I could see either team coming out on top in this, just as I said in the primer. If G2 is the better team, I'm not going to be shocked, but I am going to predict Weibo in this one. It feels like this team is peaking at the right time. Weiwei and Xiaohu were really good in that first game, and they were more of the concern for me. Like I said in my preview, I expect Weibo to do their research, and I expect Light and Crisp to be the better bot lane, and I think that's really going to be a big game changer. I will say, I do believe that Broken Blade versus the Shy could be very G2 favored if things end up going that way, but it's just something we're going to have to wait and see on. I think it's basically a 50-50, in my opinion, the closest game here in day number 2. I can't believe we're starting off with that, but this is the closest to 50-50 you're getting in day 2. I'm just very narrowly going to lean on Weibo. Then we have Bilibili versus JD Gaming, a matchup that we've seen about 100 times over the course of this year in pretty pivotal moments, in finals, in winners finals, in MSI finals, you know, just a bunch of different places. And just like in all of those, I'm gonna pick JD Gaming. They've won every single encounter that they've had against Bilibili over the course of this year. I think this is number 7 coming up on day number 2 here. I just don't see that changing here. I don't see Bilibili being a better team than they were a couple of months ago. In fact, I see them as a little bit of a worse team than they were a couple of months ago. And I think JDG is just a team you can't bet against until they actually lose. Even when they do lose, I'm still gonna believe in them. But for now, I just don't think the curse is going to be broken. Then we have LNG taking on Cloud9. Pretty intriguing matchup. I think Cloud9 is definitely the best North American team, and I think they're more interesting than people give them credit for, which is what I've been saying in the entire Worlds process. I've kind of been talking about how C9's actually really talented, like Berserker and Blabber are a very scary duo, and, you know, I think teams have to respect them, but LNG is one of the few teams in the world that is just going to be, like, much more talented than them. Like, Berserker's ridiculous, but Gala is also just ridiculous. He's even more ridiculous somehow, and Blabber's great, but, like, Tarzan's also fantastic, and then you've got Scout in the mid lane going into Eminus. This is an LNG favored matchup for sure. They are one of the best teams in the world, and they should be able to win this. And then Gen.G versus T1, another matchup that we've seen just about 100 times over the course of this year, and it's, again, gone one way basically every time, and who am I to predict an upset? Gen.G should be able to take this win. I know people are really down on Gen.G for basically no reason. I think T1's actually the betting favorite in this game, which is ridiculous to me considering how this matchup has gone all year long, but maybe the bettors know something I don't. Gen.G should be able to take this, though. I would expect them to be able to pick up the win. And now we go into the 0-1 section, starting, of course, with Team Liquid and NRG, 2 North American teams. Team Liquid looked much better in round number 1 in the 0-0, but NRG was so much better domestically, it's almost impossible for me to say that they are definitely not going to be better. I think they're better as a unit than TL is, and TL, all that they proved to me really in round number 1 is that they are the same team that ended up getting 3rd in the LCS playoffs that they couldn't quite get over the hump with, because they still can't close out games. I'm not going to predict them to be able to win this until they can prove that they can close out games against a team that does know what they're doing in the mid to late game, which NRG is. So I'm predicting NRG in this one. Then you got DK versus KT Rolster. Pretty intriguing matchup. I actually really like the way that these two teams go up against each other. I'm maybe against the grain going to go for KT Rolster on this one. Pretty crazy to say that considering KT dominated this matchup in the regular season. And at the end of the LCK playoffs, everybody would have told you that, but I think DK actually is the consensus. In this one, I'm going to go against the grain. I'm going to pick KT. They're the better team. They've been the better team basically all year long. DK has never been able to live up to the potential. And I think this is such an unfortunate draw for them because I think there is a real chance that they start the tournament 0-2. But it's crazy that one of these teams is going to start 0-2. Very, very interesting. But then we have BDS versus Mad Lions. I don't really know which way to go on this one, man. Mad is a team that has consistently underperformed in situations that have been big, but they've also done really incredible things. Remember, the last time these two teams played in a pivotal series was Spring Finals, when Mad reverse swept BDS to win those Spring Finals, and so it's hard to completely vote against Mad. That being said, I don't really believe in BDS. I know that might surprise some people, but Adam's fantastic, and Adam going into a very weakened form of Chasey could be a problem for this team, but I think Mad is more talented, so I'm very reluctantly going to pick Mad. Although, again, if BDS wins this, and if Mad just shits the bed at this international tournament, I'm really not going to be entirely surprised. I just don't think that's the Mad that we've seen. I'm going to hold out hope that they're going to be able to pick up a win here. And then finally, Fnatic versus GAM. Love GAM. Love that they got here to this part of the tournament, but no, they're not getting a win. Fnatic should be able to pick up a win in this section. They're the better team by a pretty consistent margin. If Fnatic does anything, it's absolutely slaughter teams that just do not have the talent to keep up with them in the early game, and I just don't think that GAM has that. If Razork and Humanoid can get online against Levy and against Kati, I just don't think GAM's going to be able to catch up. But watch out for that mid lane matchup in particular. Kati versus Humanoid. Humanoid can struggle sometimes with a lot of aggressive pressure, and Kati's a great laner, so definitely something to keep in mind. Not exactly a 100% lock it in for Fnatic, but they should definitely be favorites for a good reason in that game. But That's gonna do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and of course, it helps get this video out to a lot more people. If you are new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're gonna be posting about every single day of Worlds on this channel, day 2 and beyond, as we get into the finals, and then off-season's coming up. It's gonna be a fun one if all the rumors are to be believed, and so if you want to get LoL esports coverage basically year-round, this is the channel for it. If you enjoyed the video today, I promise you're gonna enjoy a lot of the rest of the content we put out the rest of this cycle. So hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.